The Ghost in the Casino, Chapter 1, The Disappearing Act. The Mirage Sands Casino shimmered under the neon glow of Atlantic City's famous boardwalk. Inside its grand theatre, a packed house erupted into applause as Adrian, the magnificent LaFleur, prepared for his signature illusion, the final escape. He stood center stage, dressed in a midnight blue suit adorned with silver stars, his charismatic smile commanding every gaze in the room. A glimmering water tank loomed behind him, its glass walls reflecting the stage lights. The audience held their breath as Adrian stepped into the tank. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice rich with theatrical flair, "prepare to witness the impossible." The curtain dropped. Moments ticked by. The orchestra played a suspenseful crescendo, but the energy in the theater shifted from excitement to unease. When the curtain rose again, something was wrong. The water in the tank had turned murky, obscuring Adrian from view. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then came the scream. Eva LaFleur, Adrian's assistant and wife, ran onto the stage, her pale face twisted in terror. She signaled frantically for the stagehands, who rushed forward to break the glass. Water cascaded onto the stage, and Adrian's lifeless body tumbled out, tangled in the chains that were supposed to be his escape. Detective Miles Harrington stood at the edge of the crime scene, his trench coat flapping lightly in the ocean breeze. Called in from New York City to consult on the case, he found himself in familiar territory. Chaos, suspicion, and secrets waiting to unravel. A casino security guard, a wiry man with a nervous twitch, briefed Harrington as they moved through the dim backstage corridors. The theater was full when it happened, the guard said, his voice trembling. Adrian had done this trick 100 times. There's no way this was an accident. People rarely die by accident in a magician's show, Harrington replied dryly, scanning the opulent yet claustrophobic hallway leading to the theater. He entered the dressing room where Eva sat slumped in a chair. Her glittering stage costume, streaked with water, shimmered faintly under the room's bright lights. Her hands trembled as she clutched a handkerchief. "Mrs. LaFleur," Harrington began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm Detective Miles Harrington. I need to ask you a few questions." Eva looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What is there to ask? My husband is dead. He drowned." "Did he?" Harrington countered. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look that simple." Her gaze flickered with something fear, perhaps. She shook her head as though unwilling to consider the possibility. "Did your husband have any enemies?" Harrington continued. "Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Eva hesitated. Adrian was intense. He pushed people, but everyone respected him, loved him. "Not everyone loves a perfectionist," Harrington said. "What about his professional rival, Jackie Vega?" Eva's lips tightened. "Jackie is jealous and bitter, but murder, that's ridiculous." Harrington made a note in his small leather-bound notebook, keeping his expression neutral. "And you, Mrs. LaFleur, where were you during the trick?" "Backstage preparing for the finale," she said, her voice shaking. "I always help set up his tricks, but I wasn't near the tank." As she spoke, a uniformed officer entered the room holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper with jagged handwriting. "We found this taped to the inside of his dressing room mirror," the officer said. "It wasn't there earlier." Harrington took the bag, examining the note. "You can't escape this time." The words chilled him, but he remained outwardly calm. "Mrs. LaFleur," he asked, "have you seen this note before?" She stared at it, her face blanching. "No, I don't know what it means." "I do," Harrington murmured. "It means someone wanted your husband dead." Harrington stepped into the casino's private theater, where the crew worked to dismantle the scene. He stood before the shattered water tank, its jagged edges glittering like broken promises. He examined the stage, noting faint scuff marks near the tank's base signs of tampering. "Detective!" a voice called out. Vincent Marcello, the casino owner, approached in a tailored suit that barely concealed his agitation. "This is a disaster," Vincent said. "Adrian was the heart of our entertainment. If this gets out, the Mirage Sands is ruined." "I'm not here to save your casino, Mr. Marcello," Harrington replied. "I'm here to find a murderer." Vincent bristled but said nothing. Harrington continued, gesturing toward the stage. Who had access to the equipment before the show? Adrian, Eva, and a few stagehands, Vincent replied. But you'd better believe I'll be reviewing everyone. And Jackie Vega? Vincent grimaced. Jackie's been a thorn in our side since he lost his slot here. He blames Adrian for his career nosedive. Let's make sure he gets an interview, Harrington said. The theatre cleared out as night turned to early morning. Harrington remained studying the tank and its mechanism. A faint scent lingered in the air chlorine, but something metallic too. He crouched near the base of the tank and spotted a small scratch on the locking mechanism. It looked deliberate. He jotted a note, standing up just as the sound of heels clicked against the stage behind him. He turned to see Claire Moreno, head of casino security and an old acquaintance, walking toward him. "Still chasing shadows, Harrington?" she asked, a wry smile playing on her lips. "Shadows sometimes lead to the truth," he replied. "Good to see you, Claire." She crossed her arms, glancing at the shattered tank. "This is going to get messy." "Messy is my specialty," Harrington said, glancing at the note again. The words "you can't escape" this time echoed in his mind. And for the first time he wondered, what was Adrian LaFleur trying to escape? End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Smoke and Mirrors. The smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke hung in the air of the casino security office as Detective Miles Harrington sat opposite Eva LaFleur. The room, with its dull fluorescent lighting and a cracked leather couch, was a far cry from the glitzy theatre where Adrian had performed his final act. Eva's hands trembled as she clutched a steaming cup of coffee she hadn't yet sipped. "You said you were backstage during the performance," Harrington began, his pen poised over his notebook. "What exactly were you doing?" Eva hesitated, her eyes darting toward the two-way mirror on the far wall, as if she expected Adrian to appear on the other side, ready to rescue her from this nightmare. "I was preparing for the finale," she said quietly. "My role was to retrieve the chains once Adrian escaped the tank." "Did anyone see you backstage?" Harrington pressed. Her lips parted as if to answer, but she closed them again and shook her head. "No, I was alone." "That's convenient," Harrington remarked, his tone sharp. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, Mrs. LaFleur, I know this is difficult, but every minute matters. Someone wanted your husband dead. If you're protecting someone—" "I'm not," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Adrian was my husband. Why would I protect someone who hurt him?" "People protect others for all kinds of reasons," Harrington replied evenly. "Fear, loyalty, guilt, take your pick." Eva glared at him, but tears welled in her eyes, softening her defiance. She wiped her face and whispered, "I don't know anything about that note or who killed Adrian. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve this." Harrington studied her carefully. Her grief felt genuine, but grief didn't preclude guilt. He'd seen enough cases to know that. After leaving the interview, Harrington made his way to the Mirage Sands Theatre, now empty except for Claire Moreno and a few technicians examining the water tank. Claire stood with her arms crossed, observing the workers. "Any updates?" Harrington asked, stepping beside her. She shook her head. "Nothing definitive. The locking mechanism on the tank was tampered with, but whoever did it knew what they were doing. No fingerprints, no obvious tools left behind." "Professional," Harrington muttered, "or someone who knew Adrian's setup inside out." Claire nodded toward the stage where a man in his late 30s with dark, slicked-back hair and a sharp suit stood examining the tank. "That's Jackie Vega, Adrian's former rival. He's been skulking around since the accident. Thought you might want a word with him." Harrington smirked. "You know me too well." Jackie Vega exuded a blend of confidence and bitterness that Harrington immediately recognized. He found him perched on the edge of the stage, flipping a coin idly between his fingers. Jackie's piercing green eyes followed Harrington as he approached. "Detective," Jackie said, his voice smooth. "I'd say it's a pleasure, but under the circumstances." Harrington gave a faint smile. "You knew Adrian LaFleur." Jackie scoffed. "Knew him? I competed with him, lost to him, and watched him waltz into this casino like he owned it. And now he's dead, Harrington said bluntly. I imagine you have thoughts about that. Jackie's smile faltered. What are you implying? Let's call it professional curiosity, Harrington said, crossing his arms. You've been vocal about your grievances with Adrian. A man in your position might find his death convenient. Jackie's eyes narrowed. Let me set the record straight, Detective. I despised Adrian. He was arrogant, manipulative, and he stole gigs right out from under me. But kill him? No, that's not my style. Style isn't everything, Harrington said. Where were you during the performance? In the audience, Jackie replied, his voice steady. Third row, left of center, plenty of witnesses. Besides, do you think I'd kill him during a sold-out show? Subtlety isn't exactly my forte. Maybe not, Harrington said, jotting down a note. But sabotage might be. Do you have access to the backstage area? Jackie smirked. Everyone in this industry knows their way around a theater, Detective. But access doesn't mean guilt. Harrington studied him for a moment, then flipped his notebook closed. We'll see. As Harrington turned to leave, Jackie called out, You're looking at the wrong trick. Harrington paused. What's that supposed to mean? Jackie leaned back, his smirk returning. Just that Adrian was full of secrets. Maybe someone finally got tired of his act. Harrington stepped outside into the crisp night air, the bright lights of the boardwalk contrasting sharply with the dark ocean stretching beyond. His mind churned with questions. Eva's alibi was shaky, Jackie had motive, and the tampered lock suggested intent rather than impulse. As he mulled over the facts, his phone buzzed. It was Claire. We've got something, she said. Security footage from backstage. You need to see this. The security office was dimly lit, with multiple monitors casting a ghostly glow. Claire stood in front of a large screen, arms crossed as the footage played. The grainy video showed the hallway behind the stage. Adrian's dressing room door opened, and Adrian himself stepped out, glancing around. Seconds later, a shadowy figure entered the frame, their face obscured by a hat. They slipped into Adrian's dressing room and emerged a minute later. Any idea who that is? Harrington asked, squinting at the figure. Claire shook her head. No clear ID yet, but look at this. She fast-forwarded the footage. The same figure appeared later, this time near the water tank. They knelt briefly at its base before vanishing into the shadows. Sabotage, Harrington said, his voice grim. And premeditated, Claire added. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. As the footage looped back to the beginning, Harrington felt a chill run through him. The figure had moved with purpose, their actions precise. Whoever they were, they had planned Adrian's death with care. And they weren't done hiding in the shadows yet. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, A Rose by Any Other Name. The Atlantic City sun rose reluctantly over the boardwalk, casting a pale light over the Mirage Sands Casino. Inside its labyrinthine hallways, Detective Miles Harrington nursed a cup of black coffee and reviewed his notes. Every detail of Adrian LaFleur's life and death felt like an illusion, each clue more baffling than the last. His thoughts returned to the security footage from the previous night, the shadowy figure, their purposeful movements around the water tank, and the ominous note all pointed to a meticulously planned crime. But the killer's identity remained frustratingly out of reach. A knock at the door pulled Harrington from his thoughts. Claire Moreno entered, holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a pristine white rose, its stem wrapped with a delicate black ribbon. This was found on Adrian's body, Claire said, setting the bag on the table. It wasn't part of the act. Any ideas? Harrington frowned as he studied the flower. Adrian was known for using white roses as his signature, he said. He'd leave them for fans, assistants, or even rivals after performances, a gesture of goodwill or arrogance, depending on who you asked. Arrogance doesn't usually get you killed, Claire replied, arching an eyebrow. True, Harrington said, but this rose wasn't left by Adrian, it was planted by the killer. Claire nodded. We're running tests on the ribbon for fingerprints or DNA. I wouldn't hold my breath, though. Whoever did this seems thorough. Even the most thorough people make mistakes, Harrington said. We just need to find them. Harrington's next stop was the interrogation room, where Oliver Harris, Adrian's obsessive fan, waited. The young man's nervous energy filled the small space as he fidgeted with his hands, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Harrington entered and sat across from him. "Mr. Harris," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk about your relationship with Adrian LaFleur." Oliver swallowed hard. I was just a fan," he stammered. "I loved his work, his magic, that's all." "Fans don't usually sneak backstage," Harrington said, his gaze unflinching. "But you did. Security footage shows you outside Adrian's dressing room hours before the performance. What were you doing there?" Oliver's face turned ashen. "I just wanted to meet him," he said, "to tell him how much his magic meant to me." "And did you?" Harrington asked. Oliver hesitated, then shook his head. "No, he wasn't there. I left." Harrington leaned forward. "You didn't leave, Mr. Harris. You were seen loitering near the water tank later that night. Why?" I didn't hurt him." Oliver's voice rose in panic. "I swear I just wanted to watch the show from up close, that's all." Harrington studied him for a long moment. Oliver's fear seemed genuine, but his story was riddled with holes. "You're not telling me everything," Harrington said, "and until you do, you're staying right here." Leaving Oliver in custody, Harrington made his way to Ava LaFleur's hotel suite. She greeted him at the door, her eyes puffy from tears and lack of sleep. The room was a stark contrast to the theater's glitzy minimalist space with muted colors and sparse furnishings. "I hope this won't take long," Eva said, her voice strained. "I've barely slept." "Just a few more questions," Harrington replied, stepping inside. His gaze fell on a vase of white roses on the coffee table. "A gift?" Eva followed his gaze, her expression softening. "Adrian sent me roses every week," she said. "It was his way of apologizing." "For what?" Harrington asked. "For everything," Eva said bitterly. "For his temper, for his lies, for treating me like another one of his props." Harrington's interest piqued. "You didn't mention this before." "What's the point?" Eva snapped. "None of it matters now." "It matters if it led to his death," Harrington said. "What was he lying about?" Eva hesitated, her fingers twisting a lock of hair. "There were rumors," she admitted, "that Adrian was planning to leave the Mirage Sands, to start a new act somewhere else. Vincent wouldn't have let that happen without a fight." "Did Adrian confirm these rumors?" Harrington asked. "No," Eva said, "but I could tell something was off. He was more secretive than usual, locking himself in his dressing room for hours. And then there was the phone call." "What phone call?" "2 nights before the show," Eva said. "I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone. He said, 'If you ruin this for me, you'll regret it.' But when I asked him about it, he brushed me off." "Did you recognize the voice on the other end?" Harrington asked. "No," Eva said, shaking her head, "but it was a woman." Harrington left the suite with more questions than answers. Adrian's secretive behavior, the ominous phone call, and the planted rose all pointed to a deeply personal motive. But who stood to gain the most from his death? Back at the theater, Harrington found Claire reviewing the stage crew's statements. "Anything useful?" he asked. "Maybe," Claire said, handing him a file. "One of the stagehands claims he saw Jackie Vega arguing with Adrian backstage the day before the performance." Harrington scanned the statement. "That tracks with what Jackie told me, except he downplayed the confrontation." "Why would Jackie lie if he had an alibi?" Claire asked. "Because alibis don't cover intent," Harrington replied. He looked at the file again. "Did anyone see Adrian's dressing room after that argument?" Claire hesitated. "Actually, yes, another stagehand mentioned something odd. Adrian left his door open when he usually locked it. He said it was empty, but the roses were missing." Harrington's mind raced. "Who had access to those roses?" "Eva, the crew, maybe Vincent," Claire said, "and Jackie if he got creative." "It's not just the roses," Harrington said. "It's what they represent, Adrian's control, his signature. Someone used them to send a message." He stared at the white rose in the evidence bag, its black ribbon stark against its delicate petals. A signature or a farewell? For the first time, Harrington wondered, who had the power to outmaneuver Adrian LaFleur in his own game of illusions? End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Under the Spotlight. The casino bustled with its usual energy as Harrington walked through the Mirage Sands. Slot machines chimed, gamblers cheered, and the tang of stale alcohol and desperation filled the air. Amid the chaos, the ghost of Adrian LaFleur's final act loomed large, drawing whispers from staff and guests alike. Harrington's destination was the Green Room, where Oliver Harris had agreed to a second interview after a restless night in custody. This time Harrington planned to push harder for the truth. Oliver sat hunched in a chair, his fingers nervously picking at the cuffs of his jacket. When Harrington entered, Oliver's gaze flicked up briefly before darting back to the table. "I told you everything," Oliver said quietly, his voice hoarse. "I didn't hurt Adrian. That's the problem," Harrington replied, taking a seat across from him. "You've told me everything except the truth. Let's try again. Why were you backstage that night?" "I just wanted to meet him," Oliver insisted. "To talk to him." "Talk about what?" Harrington interrupted, his tone firm. "Adrian was a showman, not a therapist. What could you possibly have to say to him that was so urgent?" Oliver hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally he blurted, "I wanted him to stop." Harrington frowned. "Stop what?" "Lying!" Oliver's voice rose, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Adrian wasn't who he pretended to be. He built his career on tricks, sure, but he wasn't honest about who he really was. He was a fraud." "That's a big accusation," Harrington said, leaning back. "Care to elaborate?" Oliver looked away, his shoulders sagging. "I can't prove it," he muttered. "But I know it's true. I found things online threads, rumors about how he stole his big illusions from other magicians. People trusted him, and he betrayed them." "People like you?" Harrington asked, his voice softer now. Oliver nodded. "I looked up to him, but when I found out, I just wanted him to admit it, to own up to what he'd done." Harrington regarded Oliver carefully. His anger seemed raw, personal, but not murderous. Still, deception and betrayal could spark dangerous impulses in others. "Did you confront him that night?" Harrington pressed. Oliver shook his head vehemently. "No, I was too scared. I saw him before the show, but I didn't say anything, I swear." Harrington leaned forward. "Did you see anyone else backstage? Anyone acting suspicious?" Oliver hesitated. "There was someone," he said slowly. "A woman. I didn't see her face, but she was dressed like one of the stage crew. She went into Adrian's dressing room and came out carrying something." "What was she carrying?" Harrington asked, his pulse quickening. "A small case," Oliver said, "like one of those makeup kits." "Did you recognize her?" Harrington asked. "No," Oliver said, "but she had a tattoo on her wrist, a rose." The mention of the rose reignited Harrington's suspicions. He needed to know who among the crew had access to Adrian's dressing room and bore that tattoo. But first, he had another lead to follow. Vincent Marcello's office was a stark contrast to the glitz of the casino floor. Dark mahogany furniture and thick carpets created an air of understated authority. Vincent sat behind his desk, nursing a glass of whiskey. "Detective," Vincent said as Harrington entered, "what can I do for you?" "We need to talk about Adrian," Harrington said, sitting across from him, "and the rumors about him leaving the Mirage Sands." Vincent's expression darkened. "Rumors," he said flatly. "That's all they are." "I don't think so," Harrington countered. "Adrian was planning something. You must have known. He wouldn't have kept it quiet for long." Vincent leaned back, his jaw tightening. "If Adrian was planning to leave, he didn't tell me. But if he had, I wouldn't have stopped him. He was a great magician, but no one's irreplaceable." "You don't strike me as the kind of man who lets valuable assets walk away," Harrington said. "Especially not when your casino's in trouble." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Watch yourself, detective." Harrington smirked. "Did Adrian ever mention a deal with another venue? Maybe a rival casino?" Vincent hesitated. "There were whispers about him talking to someone at the Solara resort," he admitted, "but nothing concrete. If he was planning to jump ship, he was doing it behind my back." "Convenient," Harrington said. "But I don't think you're telling me everything." Vincent leaned forward, his voice low. "Listen, I had no reason to kill Adrian. Do you think I want this kind of attention? A dead magician in my theater? That's not good for business. Neither is a magician jumping ship, Harrington said, rising from his chair. But I'll take your word for now. Back in the theater, Harrington met Claire, who was reviewing the crew's personnel files. Any luck finding our mystery woman? He asked. Claire nodded. Maybe. There's a stagehand named Daniela Vega, Jackie Vega's younger sister. She's new to the crew, but she has a wrist tattoo. Guess what it is? Oh, Rose, Harrington said, his instinct sharpening. Bingo, Claire replied. But there's more. Daniela's employment records show she started here about 6 months ago, right around the time Adrian and Jackie had their falling out. Harrington's mind raced. Where is she now? Gone, Claire said. She called in sick today, and her address on file is fake. It's like she disappeared. She won't get far, Harrington said, grabbing his coat. I'll make sure of that. As Harrington left the casino, the pieces of the puzzle began to align. Adrian's deception, the mysterious woman with the rose tattoo, and Jackie Vega's lingering grudge all pointed to a calculated act of vengeance. But the full picture remained elusive. The killer had orchestrated Adrian's death with precision, like a master magician performing their final trick. Now Harrington had to unmask them before they could vanish into thin air. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Rival's Gambit. The Mirage Sands Theatre was quiet, its grand stage stripped of the vibrant energy that had once captivated audiences. Detective Miles Harrington stood near the dismantled water tank, its shattered remnants a grim reminder of Adrian LaFleur's final performance. The list of suspects was narrowing, but the pieces of the puzzle still felt disjointed. Jackie Vega, Harrington murmured to himself, flipping through his notes. Jackie's rivalry with Adrian had been well documented, and now his sister, Daniela Vega, had emerged as a potential accomplice. But proving their involvement was another matter entirely. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Claire Moreno. Jackie's at the casino lounge, Claire said. I thought you might want to pay him a visit before he disappears into thin air. Harrington smirked at her choice of words. On my way. The casino lounge was a dimly lit oasis of leather booths and clinking glassware. Harrington spotted Jackie Vega at the bar, nursing a tumbler of whiskey and chatting with a woman whose face was obscured by her long, dark hair. Harrington approached, his footsteps deliberate. Jackie, Harrington said, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of conversation. Jackie glanced over his shoulder, his expression souring. Detective, he said, setting his glass down. To what do I owe the pleasure? We need to talk, Harrington said, motioning to a nearby booth. Jackie hesitated, but eventually obliged, sliding into the seat opposite Harrington. What now? Jackie asked, his tone impatient. I already told you I had nothing to do with Adrian's death. Let's talk about your sister, Harrington said, watching Jackie's reaction closely. Jackie's eyes narrowed. What about Daniela? She worked as a stagehand for Adrian, Harrington said. She had access to his equipment, his dressing room, and now she's missing. Care to explain? Jackie leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. Daniela's got nothing to do with this. She's just a kid trying to make a living. A living that conveniently put her in the perfect position to sabotage Adrian's act, Harrington said. I think she was helping you settle an old score. Jackie's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Then enlighten me, Harrington said, leaning forward. You and Adrian had history. He pushed you out of the Mirage Sands and ruined your career. That's motive, Jackie. Add in your sister's access to his setup, and it's starting to look like a family affair. Jackie's fists clenched on the table, but he stayed silent. Where is Daniela? Harrington pressed. Jackie's lips curled into a bitter smile. You think you're so smart, don't you? Always looking for the trick behind the trick. Well, here's the thing about Adrian. He wasn't the saint everyone thinks he was. I'm listening, Harrington said. Jackie leaned in, his voice low and filled with venom. Adrian didn't just ruin me, he stole from me. Every big illusion that made his career, they were mine. He stole my ideas, my designs, and then he blackballed me from every major venue in the country. So yeah, I hated him, but I didn't kill him. But I didn't kill. Convenient story, Harrington said. But it doesn't clear you. Jackie smirked. You're barking up the wrong tree, Detective. I didn't need to kill Adrian to watch him crash and burn. He was doing a fine job of that on his own. What do you mean? Harrington asked. Jackie's grin widened. Check his financials. Adrian was in debt up to his neck. Turns out magic doesn't pay the bills when you live like a king. Harrington left the lounge, Jackie's words lingering in his mind. If Adrian was in financial trouble, it added another layer to the mystery. Who stood to gain from his death, and how did it tie back to the meticulous sabotage of his act? Returning to the casino's security office, Harrington found Claire sifting through stacks of paperwork. Jackie says Adrian was in financial trouble, Harrington said, dropping into a chair. Any truth to it? Claire frowned. I hadn't heard that, but let me check. She tapped into the casino's financial database, her fingers flying across the keyboard. After a few moments, she paused. Well, this is interesting, Claire said, turning the monitor toward Harrington. Adrian had a private account tied to the Mirage Sands. It's been drained over the past 6 months. How much are we talking? Harrington asked. Close to $1 million, Claire replied, all transferred to an offshore account. Who had access to this account? Harrington asked. Adrian, obviously, Claire said, and Eva. Harrington leaned back, the implications swirling in his mind. If Eva knew about the money, she might have had a reason to kill Adrian. What if he found out she was siphoning funds? It's possible, Claire said, but that doesn't explain the sabotage. If this was about money, why go through all the trouble of staging an accident? Maybe it wasn't just about money, Harrington said. Maybe it was personal. Harrington's next stop was Eva LaFleur's hotel suite. She answered the door in a robe, her face pale and drawn. Detective, she said warily. What now? We need to talk about Adrian's finances, Harrington said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Specifically, the $1 million that vanished from his private account. Eva's eyes widened. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Eva, Harrington said. The transfers came from an account you had access to. Did you take the money? Eva's hands trembled as she clutched her robe tighter. I didn't take anything. Adrian handled all the finances. I didn't even know about that account. Then who did? Harrington demanded. If it wasn't you, then someone else was draining Adrian dry. Eva shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I swear I don't know. Harrington studied her, searching for any sign of deception. Her distress seemed genuine, but the money trail was damning. If Eva hadn't taken the money, then who had and why? Before he could press further, Harrington's phone buzzed. It was Claire. We found Daniela Vega, Claire said. She's at a motel on the edge of town. You'll want to get here fast. Harrington glanced at Eva, her sobs filling the room. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was far from clear. Someone had played a masterful game of misdirection, and he was running out of time to find them. End of Chapter 5. Like and subscribe for free audiobooks. Chapter 6, The House Always Wins. The dingy motel on the outskirts of Atlantic City was a far cry from the glitzy Mirage Sands. Faded paint peeled from the walls, and the neon sign buzzed faintly in the cold evening air. Detective Miles Harrington parked his car in the gravel lot, the crunch of his footsteps breaking the eerie quiet. Claire Moreno waited near the entrance to room 14, her hand resting casually on her holstered firearm. She's in there, Claire said, her voice low. Alone. We've got uniforms watching the perimeter in case she tries to bolt. Harrington nodded, adjusting his trench coat as he approached the door. He knocked firmly, his voice calm but commanding. Daniela Vega, this is Detective Harrington. Open the door. For a moment there was only silence. Then the sound of shuffling inside. The door creaked open a crack and Daniela's face appeared, pale and shadowed by the room's dim light. What do you want? She asked, her voice shaky. To talk, Harrington replied. That's all. Let me in, Daniela. Reluctantly, she stepped aside. The room was small and cluttered, the air heavy with the smell of stale fast food. Daniela perched on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I didn't do anything, she blurted as Harrington closed the door behind him. "You're not making yourself look innocent by running," Harrington said, pulling out his notebook. "Let's start with the basics. Why did you disappear?" "I panicked," Daniela admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I heard Adrian was dead, I knew people would start looking at me, but I didn't kill him." "Then why were you seen near his dressing room the night of the murder?" Harrington pressed. Daniela hesitated, her eyes darting toward the floor. "I was delivering something for Eva." "Eva LaFleur." Harrington's interest sharpened. "What were you delivering?" "A makeup case," Daniela said. "Eva gave it to me earlier in the day and told me to leave it in Adrian's dressing room before the show. She said it was for his act." "Did she say why she couldn't deliver it herself?" Harrington asked. "No," Daniela said, shaking her head. "I didn't ask. I figured it wasn't my business." "Did you open the case?" Harrington asked. Daniela hesitated again. I didn't think I should, but it felt heavy, like there was something inside it that wasn't makeup." "Why didn't you tell anyone about this sooner?" Harrington asked, his tone firm. "Because I didn't know what was going on," Daniela exclaimed, tears welling in her eyes. "And then Adrian was dead and everyone was pointing fingers. I was scared, okay?" Harrington studied her, weighing her words. If Daniela was telling the truth, Eva's involvement ran deeper than she had let on. "Where's the makeup case now?" Harrington asked. "I left it in Adrian's dressing room," Daniela said. "I swear." Back at the Mirage Sands, Harrington wasted no time heading to the theatre. The dressing room had been combed over by forensics, but if the makeup case was still there, it might have been overlooked. Claire met him outside Adrian's dressing room. "You think this case is the smoking gun?" she asked. "It's a piece of the puzzle," Harrington replied, "and we need all the pieces we can get." Inside the dressing room was a surreal mix of opulence and disorder. Costumes hung neatly on racks, but the vanity was scattered with papers, makeup, and stage props. Harrington searched systematically, opening drawers and cabinets until he found a small black makeup case tucked beneath a pile of costumes. He set the case on the vanity and carefully opened it. Inside was a neatly arranged array of makeup foundation, powders, brushes. But tucked in one corner was a small vial of clear liquid. "Bingo," Harrington muttered, holding up the vial for Claire to see. "Poison?" Claire guessed. "Could be," Harrington said. "We'll need to run tests, but if this was slipped into the water tank, it would explain why Adrian couldn't escape." Claire frowned. "Ava told you she knew nothing about the murder. If she sent Daniela to deliver this, she's lying." "Ava's been lying about a lot of things," Harrington said. "But if she wanted Adrian dead, why sabotage the tank? Why not just poison him outright?" "Maybe she wanted it to look like an accident," Claire suggested. "Or maybe someone else wanted it to look like she was behind it," Harrington countered. With the vial secured as evidence, Harrington returned to Eva LaFleur's hotel suite. This time there was no pretense of politeness. "You lied to me," Harrington said as soon as Eva opened the door. Ava's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "Daniela Vega," Harrington said, stepping inside. "She told me you gave her a makeup case to deliver to Adrian's dressing room. The same case that contained this." He held up the evidence bag containing the vial. Ava's face turned ashen. I didn't know." "Don't," Harrington interrupted. "Don't insult my intelligence. You sent that case to Adrian. Now you're going to tell me why." Tears streamed down Eva's face. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered. "Then what was it supposed to be?" Harrington demanded. Eva sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Adrian wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He controlled everything, my life, my career. I couldn't take it anymore." "So you killed him?" Harrington asked. "No," Eva cried. "I just wanted him to feel vulnerable for once, to scare him. I didn't know what was in the case. I thought it was just a prop." "Who gave you the case?" Harrington asked. Eva hesitated, her breath hitching. "Vivian, Adrian's old assistant. She said it was part of a surprise for the show. I didn't think—" "Vivian Levesque?" Harrington said, his mind racing. Adrian's former assistant had been fired months ago under mysterious circumstances. If she was involved, the motive might go deeper than anyone had suspected. Harrington stood, his jaw set. "We're not done, Eva, but for now I have someone else to find." As he left the suite, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift. Vivian Levesque had entered the game, and Harrington had a feeling she was holding the key to Adrian's final act. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7, A Fatal Illusion. Detective Miles Harrington stood outside an unassuming brownstone on the outskirts of Atlantic City. This was the last known address of Vivian Levesque, Adrian LaFleur's former assistant. Fired under murky circumstances months ago, Vivian's name had only just surfaced in the investigation, courtesy of Eva LaFleur's startling confession. Harrington's instincts told him Vivian was more than a disgruntled ex-employee. She had orchestrated something larger, something that had culminated in Adrian's death. But her role, whether mastermind or pawn, remained a mystery. He knocked firmly on the door. After a moment it creaked open to reveal Vivian herself. She was tall and striking, with sharp features and jet-black hair pulled into a loose bun. Her dark eyes flicked over Harrington, her expression unreadable. "Detective Harrington," she said coolly. "To what do I owe this honor?" "May I come in?" Harrington asked. Vivian hesitated, then stepped aside, waving him in. The apartment was sparse but tidy, its decor leaning heavily toward blacks and silvers. A single framed photo sat on the mantel, a younger Vivian standing next to Adrian, both smiling for the camera. "Nice place," Harrington said, glancing around. "I'm sure you didn't come here to admire my interior design," Vivian replied, crossing her arms. "What do you want?" "I'm investigating Adrian LaFleur's murder," Harrington said bluntly. "Your name came up." Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm not surprised. Adrian had a way of making enemies." "Including you?" Harrington asked, his tone sharp. Vivian shrugged. "We didn't part on good terms, if that's what you mean, but I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Harrington said. "I'm here to get the facts. Let's start with the makeup case you gave Eva." Vivian's expression flickered, but she quickly recovered. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games with me," Harrington said, his voice firm. "Eva told me you gave her a case to deliver to Adrian's dressing room, the same case that contained a vial of clear liquid. Care to explain?" Vivian's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill Adrian." "But you wanted him dead," Harrington said, "didn't you?" Vivian's shoulders sagged, and she let out a bitter laugh. "I wanted him ruined, not dead. There's a difference." "Why?" Harrington asked. "Because Adrian betrayed me," Vivian said, her voice trembling with anger. "He stole my ideas, my work. Everything I helped him build, he claimed as his own, and when I confronted him about it, he fired me." "So you sabotaged him?" Harrington pressed. "No," Vivian said firmly. "I gave Eva the case because I thought it was just a harmless prank, a way to shake Adrian's confidence. I had no idea it would escalate to this." "What was in the case?" Harrington asked. Vivian hesitated, then sighed. "A small device I designed. It creates a pressure imbalance enough to make the water tank's locks fail. I wanted to force him to rely on his backup system. He hated using backups. It made him look less perfect." "But someone added a vial of poison," Harrington said. Vivian's eyes widened. "Poison? I didn't—" She stopped, realization dawning on her face. "Whoever killed Adrian must have used my device as a cover." "Who knew about your plan?" Harrington asked. "No one," Vivian said. "I didn't tell a soul, not even Eva, but someone must have figured it out." Back at the Mirage Sands, Harrington met Claire Moreno in the security office. "Vivian's device explains the sabotage," he said, "but it doesn't explain the poison." "So we're dealing with two culprits?" Claire asked, arching an eyebrow. "Possibly," Harrington said. "Vivian set the stage, but someone else seized the opportunity to turn her stunt into murder." Claire nodded toward a monitor displaying footage from the casino floor. "We're running background checks on everyone who had access to Adrian's dressing room. So far, no one stands out." "What about Vincent Marcello?" Harrington asked. "He had the most to lose if Adrian left the Mirage Sands." "Vincent's shady, but I don't see him getting his hands dirty," Claire said. "He'd hire someone for that." "Then we need to find out who he'd hire," Harrington said. Harrington's instincts led him to Vincent's private office. The casino owner was in the middle of a call, but Harrington didn't wait for permission to enter. "Detective," Vincent said, covering the receiver, "this is becoming a habit." "Because you're hiding something," Harrington said, crossing his arms. "Adrian was planning to leave the Mirage Sands, and you knew it. That's motive." Vincent sighed, ending his call with a curt goodbye. "What are you accusing me of, Detective? Killing my star act? If Adrian had left, I could have replaced him." "Could you?" Harrington asked. "Because from where I'm standing, Adrian was the only thing keeping your casino afloat." Vincent's calm facade cracked. "I didn't kill him," he snapped, "but I wasn't going to let him walk away without a fight." "Did you know about the sabotage?" Harrington pressed. "No," Vincent said. "But I knew Adrian had enemies, people who wanted to see him fail. I didn't think they'd actually." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You're not telling me everything," Harrington said. Vincent hesitated, then leaned forward. "There's one person you should talk to, Mason Bennett." "The jogger who found Adrian's body?" Harrington asked, frowning. "He's more than that," Vincent said. "Mason used to work for me. He's a fixer. If someone wanted Adrian dead, Mason would know." Harrington tracked Mason Bennett to a small diner near the boardwalk. The man was seated in a corner booth, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. "Mason Bennett," Harrington said, sliding into the booth across from him. Mason didn't look up. "Detective, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You've been lying to me," Harrington said. "You didn't just stumble onto Adrian's body. You were involved." Mason smirked, finally setting down the paper. "That's a bold accusation. Got any proof?" "Not yet," Harrington admitted. "But Vincent Marcello seems to think you know more than you're letting on." Mason's smirk faltered. Vincent's always quick to point fingers when things go south. "So you were working for him?" Harrington pressed. "Not directly," Mason said. "Let's just say I'm good at solving problems, and Adrian was a big problem." "What did you do?" Harrington demanded. Mason shrugged. "I just facilitated. The real mastermind?" "You're looking in the wrong place, Detective." Harrington leaned forward. "Then point me in the right direction." Mason's lips curled into a grin. "Why spoil the fun? You're the detective. Figure it out." Harrington's patience snapped. "This isn't a game," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Adrian LaFleur is dead. If you know who did it, you'd better start talking." Mason leaned back, unfazed. "Maybe I will, but you'll have to catch me first." Before Harrington could react, Mason bolted from the booth and dashed out of the diner. "Damn it," Harrington muttered, throwing cash on the table and sprinting after him. Mason disappeared into the night, but Harrington knew one thing for certain. The chase was far from over. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Trap is Set. The Mirage Sands felt like a pressure cooker as Detective Miles Harrington returned, his mind racing after Mason Bennett's sudden flight. Mason's cryptic words, "The real mastermind. You're looking in the wrong place," echoed in his ears. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. Harrington strode into the security office, where Claire Moreno was waiting. She looked up from her monitors, her expression sharp. "Tell me you got something," Claire said. "Mason knows who did it," Harrington replied, his tone clipped. "But he ran before I could get the details." "Of course he did," Claire said with a sigh. "I'll get a team on it. He won't get far." "We don't have time for a manhunt," Harrington said. "If Mason's right, whoever's behind this might already be tying up loose ends. We need to act fast." Claire crossed her arms. "What's the plan?" "We set a trap," Harrington said, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We make them think they've won, and then we catch them in the act." Hours later, the Mirage Sands Theatre buzzed with activity as Harrington and Claire coordinated the setup. The shattered water tank had been replaced with an identical one, and the stage was rigged to replicate the night of Adrian's final act. "This is risky," Claire said as they walked through the setup. "You're counting on the killer taking the bait." "They will," Harrington said. "They can't resist the spotlight. This entire crime was staged for maximum drama. If we recreate the scene, they'll come back to finish the job or gloat." "And what's your role in all this?" Claire asked, raising an eyebrow. "I'll be Adrian," Harrington said simply. Claire's eyes widened. You're putting yourself in the tank? It's the only way to draw them out, Harrington said. If they think I'm vulnerable, they'll make their move. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but you'd better have backup. Always, Harrington said with a faint smile. The audience for the recreated act was small. Claire, a handful of officers in plainclothes, and Adrian LaFleur, who had reluctantly agreed to participate. Harrington stood backstage, dressed in one of Adrian's signature suits. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he pushed it aside. Ready? Claire asked, her earpiece crackling faintly. Let's do this, Harrington said, stepping onto the stage. The recreated act began smoothly. Harrington played his part, slipping into the water tank and allowing the stagehands to lock the lid. The cold water pressed against him, and for a moment he understood the panic Adrian must have felt. From his vantage point inside the tank, Harrington watched the dimly lit backstage area. A shadow moved too deliberate to be part of the crew. There you are, Harrington thought. The figure approached the tank, their movements purposeful. Harrington recognized them instantly, Mason Bennett. He held a small device in his hand, one that Harrington knew could tamper with the tank's mechanism. But Mason wasn't alone. A second figure appeared, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Vivian Levesque. Harrington's heart pounded as he realized the truth. Vivian had orchestrated the sabotage, but Mason had been her accomplice all along. The two exchanged a few whispered words before Mason began attaching the device to the tank's locking mechanism. Vivian hovered nearby, her gaze fixed on Harrington with cold intensity. Harrington gave a subtle signal, 3 sharp taps against the tank's glass. The trap sprung in an instant. Claire and her team emerged from the shadows, guns drawn. "Step away from the tank," Claire commanded. Mason froze, his hand still on the device. Vivian spun toward the officers, her expression shifting from shock to fury. "It's over," Harrington said as he emerged from the tank, dripping wet but alive. "You've been caught." Vivian sneered. "You think this changes anything?" "It changes everything," Harrington said, stepping closer. "You used Mason to sabotage the tank, and when Adrian didn't die the way you wanted, you poisoned him." "He deserved it," Vivian spat. "He built his entire career on lies on my ideas. He destroyed my life." "So you destroyed his," Harrington said. Vivian's defiance wavered, but Mason spoke up, his voice shaky. "I didn't sign up for this, I just wanted the money. And you got blood instead," Harrington said, his gaze piercing Mason. "You facilitated the crime, Mason. That makes you just as guilty." The suspects were cuffed and escorted out, but Harrington stayed behind on the stage. Claire approached, handing him a towel. "Well, that was dramatic," Claire said with a smirk. "Fitting, don't you think?" Harrington replied, drying his hair. "Think this is the end of it?" Claire asked. "Here's the end of the show," Harrington said, "but the fallout, that's just beginning." As the theater emptied, Harrington stood alone, staring at the water tank. Adrian LaFleur had built his career on illusions, but in the end, it was the truth that had undone him. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9, The Final Curtain Call. The interrogation room at the Atlantic City precinct was silent, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Detective Miles Harrington sat across from Vivian Levesque, her defiant gaze locked on his. Her cuffs rattled slightly as she crossed her arms, her sharp features cold and unrepentant. "Let's start from the beginning," Harrington said, his tone measured but firm. "You sabotaged the tank, but Mason poisoned Adrian. Is that how it went?" Vivian's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Oh, Detective, don't oversimplify. Adrian's death wasn't just some spur-of-the-moment plan. It was a masterpiece, a fitting end for a man who lived in illusion." "Then why involve Mason?" Harrington asked, leaning forward. "You're smart enough to have done this alone." "I needed access," Vivian admitted. "Mason worked security for Vincent Marcello. He could get me into places I couldn't reach anymore, and he had his own reasons to hate Adrian. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement." "And Eva?" Harrington asked. Vivian let out a soft laugh. "Poor Eva. So eager to please, so desperate for approval. She had no idea she was part of my plan. I needed her to deliver the makeup case so my name stayed out of it." Harrington frowned. So the sabotage was your idea, but Mason took it further. Vivian's eyes darkened. No, detective. The poison was his idea. I wanted Adrian humiliated, not dead. Mason was the one who decided to take it to the next level. Why didn't you stop him? Harrington pressed. Because I didn't care, Vivian said bluntly. By the time I realized what he'd done, it was too late. Adrian was gone. And honestly, it felt poetic. Harrington studied her for a long moment. You don't regret any of this, do you? Regret? Vivian scoffed. Adrian ruined my life. I just evened the score. In the adjacent room, Mason Bennett slouched in his chair, looking every bit the cornered man. Claire Moreno stood beside Harrington, observing through the two-way mirror. He's scared, Claire said. Good, Harrington replied. Let's see if he talks. Harrington entered the room and took a seat across from Mason, setting a manila folder on the table. He opened it, revealing photos of the water tank, the poison vial, and security footage of Mason near the crime scene. There's all here, Mason, Harrington said. You can either come clean or I can let Vivian pin the entire thing on you, your choice. Mason shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean to kill him, he mumbled. But you did, Harrington said. Why? Mason ran a hand through his hair, his voice trembling. Because he had it coming. Adrian was a fraud. He used people, Vivian, Eva, me. I thought if he was gone, we'd all be free. So you poisoned him, Harrington said. Mason nodded slowly. Vivian's plan was just to mess with his tank, but I knew that wouldn't be enough. He'd just walk away like he always did, untouchable. I wanted to make sure he paid for what he did. And you didn't care who else got hurt in the process? Harrington asked, his voice sharp. Mason's eyes filled with tears. I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted it to be over. Later, Harrington stood in his office, piecing together the aftermath. The case was technically solved. Vivian had orchestrated the sabotage, Mason had carried out the murder, and Adrian's death had been the result of their combined bitterness. But something still nagged at him. Claire knocked on the door, stepping in with a fresh cup of coffee. You look like you're trying to solve another case, she said, setting the cup on his desk. Something doesn't feel right, Harrington admitted. Claire tilted her head. You think someone else was involved? Maybe, Harrington said. Or maybe I just can't shake the feeling that we missed something. He opened the file on Adrian's financials, flipping through the records. The $1 million drained from his private account still didn't add up. Neither Vivian nor Mason had any knowledge of it, and Eva's denial seemed genuine. What if Adrian was trying to disappear? Harrington mused aloud. Claire frowned. You think he staged his own murder? No, Harrington said, but I think he was planning to leave everything behind. The money, the Mirage Sands, Eva. Maybe someone found out and used it against him. Claire nodded slowly. Whoever that someone was, they've kept themselves well hidden. For now, Harrington said. That night, Harrington returned to the Mirage Sands Theatre. The stage was empty, the water tank now a grim relic of Adrian's final act. Harrington stood in the spotlight, staring at the tank as the weight of the case settled over him. Adrian LaFleur had built his life on illusions, but in the end it was the truths he tried to bury that led to his downfall. Vivian's vengeance, Mason's desperation, Eva's complicity, all of it had converged into a perfect storm. And yet, the mystery of Adrian's missing fortune lingered like a ghost, a final curtain call that refused to drop. Harrington turned away from the stage, his mind already on the next puzzle. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10, The Ghost of the Casino. The Mirage Sands Casino had returned to its glittering facade of normalcy, the hum of slot machines and the chatter of gamblers masking the echoes of the tragedy that had unfolded there. But Detective Miles Harrington knew the shadow of Adrian LaFleur still lingered. The case was technically closed. Vivian Levesque and Mason Bennett were in custody, and Eva LaFleur was being charged as an accessory. Yet the nagging question of Adrian's missing fortune remained unanswered, a loose end that Harrington couldn't ignore. Harrington sat in his office, the morning light filtering through the blinds as he reviewed Adrian's financial records again. The $1 million had vanished into an offshore account, but the details were maddeningly vague. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Claire Moreno stepped in, holding a folder. "I've got something," she said, setting it on his desk. "What is it?" Harrington asked. "Follow up on Adrian's offshore account," Claire said. "The money was transferred to a shell corporation, and guess who owns it?" Harrington opened the folder and scanned the document. His eyes widened. "Vincent Marcello." Claire nodded. "Looks like our friend Vincent was skimming from Adrian's earnings. Adrian must have found out and was planning to expose him." "And Vincent couldn't let that happen," Harrington said, "so he set the stage for Adrian's death." Claire hesitated. "You think Vincent orchestrated the whole thing, even the sabotage and poison?" Harrington leaned back, his mind racing. "Not directly. But Vincent's the kind of man who uses other people to do his dirty work. He let Vivian and Mason handle the sabotage, knowing their motives would keep the spotlight off him. And the poison? That might have been his fail-safe." Claire frowned. "So what do we do?" "We confront him," Harrington said, standing. Vincent Marcello was in his office, a glass of bourbon in hand and a smug smile on his face. He looked up as Harrington and Claire entered. "Detective," Vincent said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Harrington didn't waste time. "We know about the offshore account, the missing $1 million. Adrian found out you were stealing from him, and you killed him to cover it up." Vincent's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "That's quite the accusation," he said. "Got any proof?" "The transfers tie back to your shell corporation," Harrington said, tossing the folder onto Vincent's desk. "And we have witnesses who'll testify that you had a motive to silence Adrian." Vincent chuckled, swirling his bourbon. "Witnesses like Vivian and Mason. Good luck getting a jury to believe them. They're murderers, detective." "They're pawns," Harrington shot back. "You used their hatred for Adrian to cover your tracks, but you made one mistake." Vincent raised an eyebrow. "Oh, enlighten me." "You thought you could stay in the shadows," Harrington said. "But every illusion has a flaw, Vincent, and yours was greed. You couldn't resist taking the money, and now it's going to bury you." Vincent's calm demeanor cracked. "You can't prove anything," he snarled. "Maybe not yet," Harrington admitted. "But I don't need to. The evidence speaks for itself, and I'll make sure the right people see it." Vincent's face darkened, but he said nothing as Harrington and Claire left his office. Later that evening, Harrington stood on the boardwalk, the salty breeze ruffling his coat. The case had taken its toll, but there was satisfaction in knowing the truth. Vincent Marcello might not see the inside of a jail cell right away, but his empire was crumbling. Claire joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You think it's over?" she asked. "For now," Harrington said. "But people like Vincent don't go down without a fight. He'll slip up again, and when he does, we'll be ready." Claire smiled faintly. "You're an optimist, Harrington. Who knew?" "Not optimism," Harrington said. "Just experience." They stood in silence, watching the waves crash against the shore. The ghost of Adrian LaFleur had been laid to rest, but the Mirage Sands would never be the same. As the lights of the casino flickered in the distance, Harrington turned and walked away, ready for whatever mystery waited in the shadows. End of Chapter 10 and end of story. Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe for free audiobooks.